Lo sapevi che luglio è storicamente uno dei mesi più positivi per le borse?
Calla, ce l'hai tirata.
Vabbè, in media, non è che puoi essere sempre sicuro.
Sai di cosa può essere sicuro a luglio? Di andare in vacanza senza imprevisti. Su facile.it confronti e trovi l'assicurazione viaggio perfetta per te, con copertura per spese mediche, smarrimento bagagli, annullamento del viaggio. I mercati saranno incerti, ma almeno le vacanze puoi fartele sereno, a partire da appena 2 euro al giorno.
Top! E mi rimborsa anche se il mercato va giù mentre sono in ferie?
No, però per tutto il resto puoi andare su facile.it. Facile.it confronta e tu risparmi.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome back to The Bull, your personal finance podcast. Some episodes of this podcast truly feel like small miracles. Even in my most optimistic dreams, I never imagined I'd have the chance to sit down with one of the world's most influential economic journalists and try to make sense together of the deeper forces behind the events that are reshaping the world as we know it, especially the disruptive actions of the current occupant of the White House. Martin Wolf is the chief economic commentator of the Financial Times, where he's been writing for an astonishing 38 years. But commander of the British Empire Martin Wolf is far more than just a journalist. In the early 2000s, he played a key role in shaping the narrative around globalization, and during the great financial crisis, he became one of the most prominent voices in support of central banks' extraordinary interventions to save the global economy. When he writes, "World leaders, pay attention." Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers once called him the world's preeminent economic journalist. Former PIMCO CEO Mohamed El-Erian said he's by far the most influential economic columnist out there. And Harvard professor Kenneth Rogoff described him as really the world's most important economic and financial writer. In recent weeks, Wolf has recorded a podcast series for the Financial Times with Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, exploring the consequences of US policy decisions for the global order, which I highly recommend you listen to. In short, we are talking about a living legend of economic journalism. As a lifelong advocate of moderate economic liberalism and as a descendant of Austrian Jewish immigrants who lost many relatives during the Holocaust, Wolf carries in his DNA a deep intolerance for authoritarianism in all its forms. It's no surprise, then, that in the conversation you're about to hear, his judgment on Trump's initiatives is anything but sugar-coated. I'm still talking before leaving the stage just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the guest we have the honor to host. Fully aware that I was probably not up to the task of matching such a distinguished guest, I nonetheless hope that this episode can offer you some clarity in navigating the historic events we're currently living through. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Martin Wolf. Enjoy the episode! Dear Mr. Wolf, welcome to my podcast, The Bull.
Okay, I'm pleased to be there.
It's a true honor to have here one of the most respected economic commentators in the world. So, Mr. Wolf, thank you for helping us understand what's going on during this 2025, which is a kind of year when decades happen. I thought your point of view would be helpful to walk us through what's going on in this world that seems to be undergoing a total reshaping because of the new head of the White House and his tariffs war. If you don't mind, I would like to start from here, and my first question is, did you understand why he did start it all? Because I never thought when doing groceries that the shop must buy something from me unless they want me to impose some reciprocal tariffs. Why did this thing suddenly become a problem from Trump's perspective?
I think that I have sort of two answers to that question. The first is, I really don't know, and I'm not at all sure that he knows.
Okay.
Obviously, he has a pretty unique perspective on trade. And I think, this is a guess, it comes from the way he thinks about his own role as a businessman. So he sees, he's a real estate developer, not a very successful one, by the way, that's another matter. So from his point of view, he does a deal with somebody else to build something or to sell something or to buy something. And this is a bilateral deal. Basically, there are two sides, and his job is to get a better deal than the other side in this bilateral relationship. And from his point of view, he wins if he sells something which is worth more than he has to buy from them. I mean, it's a very simple way of thinking about it. You know, if they pay me more than I pay them, then in this deal, I have made a profit. You know, he sees this as my profit in this deal. And the bigger my profit, the better off I am. And he thinks that he extends this notion of, I think, this is my interpretation, it's a guess, of the bilateral deal making that he has in his business to every sort of economic transaction. So he doesn't think about all the people from whom he buys stuff to whom he never sells anything. And, you know, the restaurants he goes to, the supermarkets he goes to, he doesn't think that, oh, I'm losing money every time I pay for groceries and they don't buy an apartment block from me. He thinks that he just separates out completely from his experience of economics and the economy. And he's not an economist at all. He doesn't understand any of that. And he extends this view of his even beyond ignoring all that to the international sphere. And he says, therefore, well, if the United States is paying more to other countries than they're buying from it, this is a loss, just as it would be for me if I paid more for something. And my bilateral partner, the person with whom I'm doing a deal, doesn't pay the same amount to me, because then I'd be making a loss. I think this is the only way I can understand it, and that's one aspect. That I think that's how I understand the deal making from his point of view. He also has a strange idea of economic history. Again, that's not completely unheard of in America. This is less eccentric, which is the idea that during the 19th century, America was highly protectionist. That went on until the 20th century. It was much more protectionist than any other major economy, and it grew very, very rapidly. And so he thinks that as long as you have protection, and that's why he constantly talks about Mr. McKinley in the late 19th century, then America will boom again, and it will industrialize again, because that's when America industrialized. Again, this is sort of ignorant, but it's his perspective on history, and he has these idées fixes, these fixed ideas about how the world works, and he's completely inflexible. He's very old. He's not very intelligent. He has essentially no understanding of economics as a system. He's convinced he's a genius. He believes in his guts. So that's who he is. And there have been other dictators in the past with a similarly ill-informed and primitive view of the world, which they believe absolutely is the living embodiment of truth. And that's basically what we're dealing with.
Very interesting. By the way, thank you so much for being so outspoken. There are two things I can't really understand. Number one is Trump talks a lot about imbalances in goods, but if we take into account services and all the non-material stuff that the United States sells all around the world, the trade deficit is not that high. And that's exactly the reason why the US prospered in the past, by buying stuff from emerging markets, Europe and Japan, and selling them financial assets, treasuries, technology, and so on and so forth. The second thing I don't understand is he wants to achieve a lot of goals with his strategy. Let's call it strategy, like rebuilding American manufacturing, boosting exports, funding the big beautiful bill, etc. But while all the goals can be desirable per se, they are contradictory to each other. I don't really understand the general picture in which all the elements can coexist together. Have you got a clue about it?
Well, I think that follows from what I said before. I think it's the wrong question. In order to, so I'll start with the latter point, and then I'll go to the former. To understand the economics of trade in goods and services, in factor services, and in capital, you dealt with all those. You have to see how these things fit together in an accounting framework. You need some sense of how national accounts work and how national accounts interact within the world economy. And most non-economists don't understand that. I mean, it's very obvious if you talk to them. I've had this experience 20 years ago. I've had this experience, actually, to give an example much closer to home for you, when arguing with Germans during the Eurozone financial crisis. So I said, I wrote this at length, and I had a book which I wrote about this. Okay, the Germans have an economic structure in which they run a very, very large current account surplus. So they are, and Germans like accumulating debt claims rather than equities. They have very little taste for large-scale purchase of foreign real assets. They like lending through bonds and banks, very simply. Then they say, well, but these countries that we are interacting with, particularly in the Eurozone, they're all accumulating debt. And to which my answer is, well, of course they are, since you're running a current account surplus.
Someone else has to.
Somebody else has to run the deficits. And since you want to fund them with bank debt and bonds, they're obviously going to issue bank debts. The other side of this trade, bank debts and bonds. So your economy and their economy are symmetrical, exactly as they have to be. And if you want to stop them from borrowing, then you have to stop lending. That's basically it. And they didn't get it. It was very, very difficult to make people understand that. Similarly, they couldn't understand that if countries were going to borrow less, dramatic, something else had to give in those economies. And the obvious thing is they end up in recessions, very deep recessions. Now, the problem is that Donald Trump doesn't understand any of this, none of it. Whether there are people in his administration who understand that is not clear to me. My impression at the moment is there isn't anyone. They don't have any real economists. I'm not convinced Mr. Besant understands any of this. He's a speculator. He doesn't need to understand this sort of national accounting. I suspect he doesn't. That may be unfair, but I'm sure that most of the people in his administration have no idea about any of this. And Mr. Trump certainly doesn't have any idea about any of this. So, for example, a point I made in my column this week, I've made many, many times. He says, I'm going to raise tariffs, and that is going to eliminate the trade deficit. I'll raise tariffs on every country that's running a surplus with my country, and that will eliminate the trade deficit. And the answer to that is no, it won't, as long as you continue to run an economy in which expenditure vastly exceeds income. So what will give? Well, the most obvious things that will give if you pursue this policy, the most obvious thing is exports will shrink. You know, the adjustment will occur on the export side. You're preventing it from occurring on the import substitute side, so it will happen on the export side. Alternatively, the price level will adjust up sufficiently that other things being equal, given nominal expenditures, that's a big question, real expenditures will shrink. And that means that that's another way of bringing this into balance. But that's, of course, inflationary. So the point is that it doesn't add up, and the adjustment will occur in some other way that they don't want. But if you ask the big question, do they understand that in order to close the current account deficit, they have to increase output, very difficult since they're close to full employment, or reduce expenditure? And since the principal sector running a huge excess of
it's the government
over income is the government, you can't run enormous fiscal deficits. Do they understand that? No, of course they don't. It's quite evident that they don't. Now, then, let me go back to your first question, which is why does he focus on goods rather than services? Well, again, he doesn't understand the current account. He doesn't understand the trade balance. He understands very specific bilateral balances. And why does he focus on goods? Because I think there's an ideological and a political reason, if you like. The ideology, which is a sort of very common ideology, and very common, you must have experienced in Italy too, which is sometimes called manufacturing fetishism. The people have a fetish about manufacturers. They think manufacturers is real, it's the basis of power. When you do manufacturing, you employ decent male workers, the sort of people that you think you should care about, not the sort of people who work in the service sector or effete intellectuals or women. I mean, there's some very primitive chauvinism here. And but there are some more valid things. You may feel some manufacturers are vital for security. That's, I think, not implausible. So you need to focus on them. So he is an old man born in the 40s, and he thinks the sort of manufacturing economy that existed then is what should have survived forever. And so that's what he focuses on. When he looks at China, he looks at the fact that it now is the biggest manufacturing country in the world by far. And that's, to his mind, how America has lost out. So he doesn't really understand the tech sector. He doesn't really understand the service sector. To him, they're not really real. They don't do stuff that involves actually making things. It's probably important that he was a real estate developer, and real estate developers are engaged in not exporting, but in making things that are solid and real and tangible.
Sure.
Buildings. I think the tech sector that surrounds him, the service sector, which has helped to buy him the presidency, these are not sectors he understands. These are all instinctual responses to the economic system. And since he hates experts and he hates people who think they know more than him or are smarter than him, he won't have anything to do with them. So even if he has one or two smart people, and he doesn't have many, they're mostly imbeciles this time around him, he's not going to listen to them. So you're dealing with somebody with a very primitive view of the world, and he was put there because a very large number of Americans with similar attitudes wanted a leader like that. And people in the wealthier and more intelligent people bought the presidency for him because they thought, well, at least he's going to lower taxes and he won't regulate us. That's the deal. And that's what you've got.
Sure. In my naive mind, I thought the US was a democracy, not a dictatorship. There should be a Congress, there should be other institutions with savvy people in charge whose role is exactly to oversee the president's decisions and counterbalance his power. Now it's all about executive orders. This is not democracy any longer.
They would, of course, argue that since he won the election, it is democracy. The people elected him to do whatever he likes. So you could say, this is sometimes technically called in English, a plebiscitary dictatorship. It is, yes, you have elections. You have elections in India. You have elections in Turkey. They're not very competitive elections, but they're elections. And then when you've won, you've been anointed by the people and you're now sort of God. So the important thing here is to distinguish types of democracy. And the point I would make is what you mean by democracy is what I would call liberal democracy, namely democracy which is embedded in division of powers, constitutional constraints, legal system, constitutional courts, all these obvious things. So Trump doesn't recognize any of those things, nor do his supporters. I'll come in a second to why they don't. But they would say we are democratic. The fascists in the interwar period tended to say they were Democrats because they'd all won one election. Well, more or less. More or less. I won't push that too far. But anyway, that's the view that he holds, that he has been given the power to do what he likes by the people who want him to do this. Now, this then comes to the question of what's going on in the US, the broader point beyond Trump himself. And here there are, I think, two aspects which I've written quite a bit about in the last 10 years. The first is, like every constitution, constitutions are fragile, and they're always complicated because writing down a constitution that covers every eventuality is really, really hard. So there has to be goodwill, and there has to be an understanding that the various players in the system, which we've just talked about, the legislators, the executive itself, the courts and the Supreme Court, which is obviously part of the courts, they have to play their role. They have to be prepared to play their role. And when constitutions break down like this, that's because people cease to be willing to play their role, usually because they're either fanatics, that is to say, they really believe in the great leader, or they're frightened, or both. And I think it's a combination of those two things that are explaining why the Republicans, and to a lesser degree the courts, and therefore the Congress and the Supreme Court, are behaving in the way they are. That is, being so weak and refusing to constrain the leader. And if these institutions refuse to play their constitutional part because they're fanatics or they're frightened, then of course the presidency gives the presidency as an institution gives its holder immense power. He is, after all, the supreme commander. Legally, he can order the armed forces to do whatever he likes. He is head of the executive, and the executive has vast powers. Some of them that, in my view, it should never have held, like the control over the justice system, the Department of Justice, and many new other powers. So he has immense power of coercion. That's obviously completely obvious. And if the other institutions in the system, which have discussed, don't wish to or can't manage to constrain him or don't want to, and that's seemed pretty clear with the Supreme Court, then he can do an immense amount. And then finally, if the people have decided, and I think the people who voted for him have mostly decided, they want a revolution. They want the constraints imposed upon their leader removed. They want their leader to be able to do whatever he wants in their sense, in their interest. If they regard the opposition as fundamentally illegitimate, for a whole host of reasons, culturally illegitimate, ethnically illegitimate, ideologically illegitimate, then they will support a leader who is prepared to overthrow the whole system. Now, it has been a surprise to me that in the last 10 years, that set of attitudes and ideas has been held by so many Americans, not the majority, by the way, but so many Americans, that and a relatively small proportion of the electorate together will give a majority to somebody like Trump twice. But once that's happened, the system will cease to function because the constraining institutions will collapse because they're unwilling or unable or too frightened to impose the necessary constraints. And when I wrote about this first, which was in March 2016, so before he even became president, and I wrote a column whose headline was Donald Trump is how great republics meet their end. I made the explicit parallel because it interested me with and it's something I know quite a bit about because of what I studied at university. And it's a parallel which means quite a bit to you, which is the collapse of the most powerful republic before the American Republic, which was the Roman Republic.
Of course.
And its replacement by the empire. Now, it's pretty obvious to anybody who looks that what Trump is trying to do is to create an American equivalent of the Roman Empire. Will he get away with it? How will that work? How will they manage the succession? Not that the Roman Empire ever really managed the succession very well. But I think that's what's going on. That certainly surprised me, but it didn't surprise me colossally, given what had already been happening in America, financial crisis and so forth, the change in American politics and society that had been occurring, and the change in ideology associated with that. So I'm surprised, and I was surprised, but I wasn't that surprised, and that's the process we're seeing.
What should allies do? On August the 1st, the European Union will be charged with 30% tariffs, unless, of course, an unlikely deal will be struck before that, which are unacceptable. 30% tariffs means embargo. Should they give in, retaliate, or simply try to find alternative markets to the US? What is your perspective on it?
My view, as I expressed in my column this week, is the rest of the world should retaliate. And ideally, they should do it together. So they should, perhaps the obvious thing to do is everybody agrees to levy a tariff on the US, which is equal to the tariff that the US is levying on them. I'm not suggesting Laos and Cambodia, and that would be ridiculous. But G20 countries should do that. And In aggregate, the economies of the rest of the G20 are bigger than the US significantly, and it would hurt. It would really hurt. I think ideally that's what they should be prepared to do, because this man is a bully, and the only thing that he will pay attention to is retaliation. I think that is right. The argument against this is obviously, first of all, that it'll be very unpleasant and it might end up in a death spiral. But the particular argument against this for the Europeans is that it remains the case. In a way, it's not true for China or India, but it is true, of course, for Japan, Korea. The countries that are allied to the United States are multiply dependent on the US, above all for security. And that remains the case. And it will remain the case, even if the Europeans were more determined and more resourceful than seems likely to me. But it will remain the case for a decade. And that makes it very, very difficult to have a real trade war with America. And I understand the fear about that very, very well. And of course, that's multiplied. The problem is multiplied by the fact that Europe is very far from united, and politically or economically or socially, and there are lots of people in European countries that are quite sympathetic to some aspects of Trump's ideology. And there are lots of people who at least want a quiet life and certainly don't want to get involved in a massive conflict with the US in this area, in which case I suppose they're likely to give in. But if they do give in, my guess is that won't change what Trump does. And that will be quite a big problem.
Very recently, one of your colleagues, Robert Armstrong, coined the famous acronym TACO, Trump always chickens out, which is a general framework to understand the way he behaves, which consists in raising the bar to absurd levels, to negotiate in a muscular way, but willing from the beginning to land at a lower level. Let's assume now that he just wants to change a little of the global trade system, and not that much as implied by these huge tariffs he talks about every day. Do you think that the global order has already changed for the world, no matter the final tariff level? I mean, in the last 8 years, the world, or at least the Western world, prospered thanks to free trade, and from 2001, thanks to globalization. Is the world we have known so far over?
Well, you basically asked two questions there. So they are slightly separate. So let me, but they're linked. I agree. So on Robert Armstrong, my friend Robert Armstrong's brilliant acronym, I'm told by Americans that it should be TACO, but it's Mexican, I think. Anyway, sure, it is Mexican because it's a form of food which comes from Mexico, at least so I understand. Anyway, I don't know whether he will always chicken out, but he's certainly raising the ante at the moment given what happened on April the 2nd, going through with the plans he now has would be pretty provocative. And but on the same time, threatening to do it a second time and not doing it is really likely to convince people that it's TACO, and that's humiliating. So my instinct, although I think it's a brilliant coinage, my instinct is that one cannot rely on somebody like him backing down because it's become inconvenient to continue. Because I think he is very frightened of the idea that he will be seen as weak, cowardly, pusillanimous, the sort of person who backs down because it's costly. And now that he's promised essentially to do it again within a few months, just over 3 months, it would seem to me so obviously ludicrous for him to back down that I wouldn't rely on it. So I think it's a brilliant coinage, but I don't really believe it. I tend to think that weak, irrational, self-indulgent people can push themselves into a corner in which, once they're in that corner, they will actually do the crazy thing. And now you would say that rationally they shouldn't do it, but that's what he's done. He now done it, as it were, twice. And to back down twice would seem, I think, to be really hugely humiliating, because it would make Robert's point for us all. But I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But my guess is that it's really quite likely he will go ahead with quite a bit of this, unless he gets concessions. And his belief is that he will always get concessions in the end. Now, he might get concessions from the EU, I don't know what, and from other major partners, and he will then dress it up as a great victory. And that will be enough. It depends on what the EU offers.
Yeah, though there's not a lot to give from Europe.
You know, the EU is not going to give away the VAT. It's not going, it can't, obviously it can't. Its tariffs are already near zero. Agriculture is really the only thing they can give away that matters at all. And actually, Trump has been showing that he doesn't care much about farmers. So my instinct is that there's not much that the EU can give. And the bottom line is, I think it's very, very likely, quite likely, that he will go ahead and do this. Now, let me just, maybe it's my final comment, what's happened to the world order? My own view on this is very, very clear. And I said this more or less at the beginning of this. We're not going to go back to the way the world was. This is a decisive change in the world. That will even be true if there were further elections for the president, of which I'm not sure, and he was defeated, or any replacement he seeks to put in this position is defeated. So the politicians who replace him are normal, and things sort of go back to normal. But the problem is, so long as we remember this experience, so long as there is a possibility that it could be repeated, because there's still a MAGA movement, there's still the demands from this movement, which seems to be overwhelmingly probable, then it is overwhelmingly probable that we'll have a Trump 3 or 4. Not necessarily Trump, it could be Vance, it could be one of his children, it could be somebody else. But we can look at America and say, this is not the America we knew. And we cannot assume just because a nice Democrat or moderately nice Democrat won, that now we've got the America we knew back. Because we might have thought that when Biden won, but we were wrong. And now it's clear that we were wrong. So I think it would take a generation, at least, to persuade people that this United States, the Trump US, the MAGA US, has gone. At least a generation. It could well be longer. And it might be forever. And my guess is that's too long to rebuild the system. So the trust on the basis of which the system was built, the trust particularly on the basis of which the alliances of the US were built, so with Europe and the countries in East Asia, Australasia, that cannot be rebuilt. And this is a revolutionary moment in politics. It might well go far further, because it's quite clear there is a similar MAGA-type movement in parts of Europe. And so there's a big risk at home. I would say that the sort of liberal democratic internationally cooperative world that the US tried to create after the Second World War with its allies, which seemed to be victorious when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, that world of sort of liberal optimism, broadly defined, has gone. And we have to accept that it has gone. I don't want to accept it, and I absolutely hate it, but I can't see any plausible way that the innocence we had, now lost, can be reborn.
Mr. Wolf, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. I would love this conversation to last hours, but I know it's going to be impossible because of your very tight agenda. But it was a true honor to have you here. You gifted us with a lot of perspectives about what's going on. I hope we can have you back in the future. And for now, thank you for being here and for whatever you write every week, which is a light for us to understand the world we are living in.
Right. It was a pleasure to be with you. I enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it too. Bye-bye. And that's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different episode, a bit off our usual track, and that it gave you the chance to discover one of the most extraordinary voices in global economic journalism. If you haven't been following him already, I strongly encourage you to do so. His insights offer a privileged perspective on the major forces reshaping our world. A huge thank you to Martin Wolf for joining us, and he has already promised he will be back at the end of the year to help us make sense of this incredible 2025. In the meantime, don't forget to hit follow and turn on notifications on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us keep bringing you new conversation with some of the greatest economic minds in the world. It's really all for today, but we'll be back next Sunday right here, as always, with a brand new episode of The Bull, your personal finance podcast.